I call the Honourable David Parker.
I could take 10 minutes, Mr Speaker, debunking some of the spurious claims made by the last speaker, but I think I can do it by addressing one of them, and that was the economic illiteracy shown by that minister to claim that asking farmers to pay for 10% of their agricultural emissions, the cost of which is currently borne by taxpayers and other sectors of the economy, was going to put up the price of milk. So increasing New Zealand costs of farmers by a small amount is going to put up the cost of milk, when Fonterra and the government have recently been on record as saying the price of milk is set by the international price paid for milk and other commodities. You can't have it both ways, Ms Wilkinson. You cannot have it both ways. The reality is, other than some constraints as to whether there's monopoly pricing, New Zealand's milk price is set by the international price of milk. Mr Speaker, this budget was an important budget for this country because it was a time when New Zealand needed a government to lead it to build our nation and to build our economy, because New Zealand really is at a crossroads. And this election is going to be a stark choice for electors, because they'll see on the basis of this budget that National's taking them in one direction and Labour would take them in another. The choice is very stark. We have, on the one hand, an outcome from the National government which says it's pretty much easy go, we'll cut a bit of spending here, but other than that we're going to leave the settings of the economy pretty much unchanged, and that'll do. We might have to sell a bit of the family silver, we'll end up not owning many of our productive assets, we'll sell a bit more of our land, our dairy farms, they're not too worried about that, and they'll sell off the energy companies that are currently owned by the government, or half of them, and similarly Air New Zealand. But they'd have you believe that that leads you to nirvana. And on the other hand, we have the Labour Party who's saying, look, no, it's time that we accept that New Zealand needs to act differently and that we need to earn our way in the world by exporting more goods and services. So that's my message today, that if you want to have some hope that we're going to have a country that grows in prosperity in the future, we actually do have to change the settings of our country in a way that leads to us exporting more goods and services. And the reason for that is quite simply that for some decades now, we as a country have spent more than we've earned. We've spent more than we've earned, we've run current account deficits, we've borrowed money to fund consumption, and as a consequence we are in a worse position than a lot of other countries, and we're in a worse position than we should be. And in order to stop that happening again, you actually have to change the economic settings of the country. Otherwise, the same thing will happen again. It's no secret, like every other Western country in the world, New Zealand binged on consumption fuelled by rising levels of private debt. Now, it is true that because of the prudence of the last Labour government, between 2000 and 2008, we substantially reduced government debt, very substantially, or else we would be in New Zealand in the position of Greece and Portugal, Spain, Great Britain, Ireland, all these countries that are in a very dire position at the moment. So look, for a start, let no one be fooled. The truth is that Labour was, contrary to the rhetoric of the National Party, fiscally responsible. We always have been when you look at our history. It was National that over that period opposed every budget and called for unaffordable tax cuts that would have further fuelled inflation, asset bubbles and debt bubbles. And it's National who, since the election, have had a failed economic policy for this country which is largely based on tax cuts, 42% of which have gone to the top 10% of the population. It's that economic prescription that has led to us as a country this year facing a $16.7 billion deficit. Mr Speaker, it's clear that the government has only one major plank to its economic policies, and that's tax cuts. Now, tax policy is important. I don't deny that tax policy is important, but economic policy has to be more than tax policy, and it certainly has to be more than tax policy with those tax cuts, income tax cuts, weighted to those who already earn the most. And it's plain that the economy's stalled, and that the reason that there is little good news in terms of new export sectors that we need in this country is because the government has no economic plan other than tax cuts weighted to those who already earn the most. The budget makes for dim and dismal reading. It projects that the current account deficit goes up to over 6%, in fact close to 7% over the next 4 years. The government's trying to convince New Zealand that we're now in such a hole that we should sell the family silver, half of all of the electricity is so easy in New Zealand, to fill the hole. But the reality is changing who owns those assets that already exists does not change the output of the New Zealand economy. And again, it shows how bereft the government is of vision. And I say that after 3 years of mismanagement, or I would say mismanagement, let other people assess whether it's mismanagement or not, after 3 years of management by the national government, it's fair to ask them whether they're doing okay. What measures should we use? The measures they chose themselves. The first was closing the wage gap with Australia. Is that getting better? No, it's getting worse. The second was the promised aggressive recovery from recession. That hasn't occurred. Despite record prices being paid for our mainly primary produce exports in buoyant economies in Australia and China, our major trading partners. The promised step change in the economy hasn't happened. In fact, it's disappeared from their language. Now, there is one thing I agree with the Honourable Bill English on. That was that he says that New Zealand's total indebtedness to the rest of the world is the metric upon which we should measure our long-term success. He says it's a serious problem. I agree. Well, what does this budget show? This budget projects those figures out for another 4 years, i.e., by the end of this budget document, National will have been in power, if they have their way and are re-elected, which we obviously disagree with, that they would have had their way for 6 years. And what does the budget project? It projects that every year from here on, New Zealand's net investment position gets worse, Jackie Dean, worse every year. Currently, New Zealand's net international indebtedness, that's everything we owe to the rest of the world less what they owe to us, is 78.6% of GDP forecast for this year. And every year from here on in the forecast period, it gets worse and worse, Jackie Dean, so that by 2015, in the words of your own budget, New Zealand's net international debt rises to 85.3% of GDP. In other words, using the government's own predictions and assuming they win, it gets worse from here on in. So it really is fair to question the government's management of the economy. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party agrees with the New Zealand Institute in their report, "A goal is not a strategy," and that is that New Zealand, in order to lift our economic fortunes, has to do more than sell primary produce. Now, primary produce and forestry and agriculture and aquaculture, these are all very important and will be the mainstay of New Zealand's economy for a while yet. Indeed, forever. But New Zealand cannot get ahead on those exports alone. And that's where we need policies which will drive the breadth and value of our exports. And that's the sort of economic policy that Labour's bringing forward. And already we've got more policy out there in terms of substantial change to economic settings than National has after 3 years in government. We have proposals to change monetary policy in a number of ways which will improve the outcome for New Zealand exporters. Do you know that New Zealand's currency is more speculated and more traded than the Russian ruble, the Indian rupee, the Brazilian real? These are all economies that are massively bigger than New Zealand, and yet our economy is speculated and more in part because of our monetary policy. We would change our monetary policy. The other thing that you need to have a burgeoning new export sector is you need depth in capital markets. Therefore, you need more improvement in savings and therefore have more investment. How can you do that if you cut KiwiSaver? We need fair tax systems, not income tax cuts weighted to those who are most wealthy, and another of other changes, including an R&D tax credit that we've already announced.
I call the Honourable Minister Hickey